Welcome to Noisecutter.
All right, and so welcome to this episode of the Noisecutter podcast. I'm your host, as always, Rex Chatterjee. So we're trying out a new format for this episode, and it's a readout of an issue of the Noisecutter newsletter on which, we're trying out this new format. It's called Talking Points. And so the idea is it's the same kind of level of insight and depth, but we're trying to condense things into a tighter bullet point format, making it easier to read, easier to get through, so you're kept up to date on the latest in global headlines, but without having to spend nearly as much time, getting there. So this is a readout of the talking points from 17 March 2024. And the first thing we've got to talk about here is Israel and Gaza, and we've titled this segment Schumer's Own Goal versus Netanyahu, and we'll get into why it's an own goal in just a minute. So last week, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer gave a speech on the Senate floor warning Israel that it may soon become a global pariah, quote unquote, and calling for elections to be held in Israel. The key quote here, quote, Netanyahu coalition no longer fits the needs of Israel after October 7, end quote. So that's a big, bold statement to make. Earlier today, as of the date of writing, Netanyahu went on CNN to respond, calling Schumer's comments, quote, totally inappropriate and characterizing the remarks as unacceptable meddling in the affairs of a fellow democracy. Schumer's comments were unexpected by the general public, to say the least, and they were indicative of a growing frustration among many in the world, including, for example, Democrats in the U.S., with Netanyahu's approach to Gaza. Israel will soon begin operations in Rafah in southern Gaza, where roughly 1.4 million civilians reside and or have fled to. Meanwhile, ceasefire and hostage release talks are still kind of puttering along after a sticking point earlier this month when Hamas failed to provide Israel with a list of hostages still alive in Gaza. So what's the color here? Schumer could have handled the phrasing in the speech better. There's been rising pressure on Democrats to be critical of the way in which Israel under Netanyahu's leadership has prosecuted the war in Gaza. For example, the, quote, uncommitted vote campaign that took place in the Michigan primary. And with, unfortunately, historic civilian casualties in Gaza, it's not without good reason. However, it's one thing to criticize an approach to a conflict, and entirely another thing to frame it in a need for a government change, particularly when that government is A, democratically elected, and B, of an allied country. Netanyahu's domestic support has been waning for quite some time, triggered in part by a how did you let this happen reaction to the events of October 7th. And that's kind of justified in my view, right? He was the guy promising security, and October 7th happened on his watch. However, that's an issue for Israelis to solve. And Schumer's remarks, which, it's easy to characterize them as outside meddling because that's kind of what it is, they weren't helpful to anyone for any purpose. One might argue that they, quote unquote, pave the way for others in the Democratic Party to be more critical of Israel's conduct in Gaza. But if anything, they went too far, boomeranged, and turned up into something of an own goal. In the coming election, Democrats absolutely need the support from the segment of their base that views the U.S.'s support of Israel's actions in Gaza as unacceptable. But what that segment wants to see isn't just more rhetoric. It's a cessation, or at least a major scaling back, of the U.S.'s arms sales to Israel, right? And for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the immense lobbying power of the U.S. defense industry. I just don't think that's going to happen, despite Biden's rhetoric to the contrary. All right, turning to Ukraine, we're calling this a stalemate that threatens to rearrange the world. 2 years on, the war in Ukraine continues. There's considerable debate among informed parties about whether or not, at this point, things have ground to a stalemate. Some folks say yeah, others no. Still others argue that while things had been stalemated, it's Russia that's now gained the upper hand, at least for now. So much of the success has to do with Russia's relative success in boosting its arms production domestically. To the worry of Western Europe and the United States, Ukraine has not been without its own success. As of the past several weeks, it's managed to conduct successful strikes on 12 Russian oil refineries, dealing a blow to the latter's vital energy sector. Likewise, Russian groups fighting on behalf of Ukraine have stepped up attacks in order to sow division and unrest on the eve of Russia's presidential election, which I think we know how that's going to turn out. Likewise, despite the death of longtime Putin critic Alexei Navalny in a Russian prison last month, supporters of Navalny and his cause continue to struggle to undermine Putin within Russia. Nevertheless, Putin obviously looks set to win re-election in a functionally non-contested election fueled in part by forced voting in Russia-captured Ukrainian territory. So what's the color on this? I don't see the war ending in 2024, but I do see a more fractured world developing along the conflict lines. Russia continues to purchase drones and other technology from Iran, with Iran now setting up production of drones inside of Russian territory, inside of Russia. Likewise, North Korea continues to ship arms to Russia. It's a key support for the otherwise struggling North Korean economy, right? These arms exports. And on the non-armed side, sanctions on Russia, they don't mean that Russian goods don't get sold and that, Russia has no meaningful way to turn stuff into money. But rather, they get sold for less and to countries that are not abiding by the sanctions, some of which include U.S. allies like India. Sure, the sanctions cut value from Russia's bottom line, but they also work to somewhat force these alternative trade relationships to succeed. There's just no choice in the matter. Whenever the war in Ukraine does end, the thing to think about is how the world will have changed and how enduring those changes will be. There's more to the story than simply keeping Russia out of Ukraine and, by extension, Europe. Maybe, right? But time will tell on how the world looks once this is all said and done. Moving on to Haiti and an attempt at the impossible. So for those who haven't listened to it yet, we ran a full-length episode of the Noisecutter podcast on the ongoing crisis in Haiti. For more, there's an article in Vox that neatly summarizes the relevant events to date. And just a sidebar here, whenever I'm mentioning something that, there's an article or an episode or etc., there's almost always a link to it in the show notes. So just click on the link to our website that you'll find wherever you're listening to this podcast episode, and you'll be linked to the page on our website that contains all of the references for what we're talking about here. But back to it. There's an actual answer as to why Haiti and its economy are the way they are today, right? And that's the reparation payments that Haiti made to its former slave masters, France. Now, the story is long and complicated, but it is worth understanding. And the best telling of it is in an article in the New York Times. Again, I've linked to it. And you can either read or listen to that article courtesy of the Times. It's long, but it is worth understanding this piece of history that, quite frankly, doesn't really get taught. There's going to be a transitional council seeking to set up a new government in Haiti after the resignation of former Prime Minister Ariel Henry. Its success, however, depends on its ability to convince several cabals of organized and armed gangs to cooperate, and that's an almost impossible task. Moving on to Boeing, the headline here is, man, these guys can't seem to do anything right. In connection with its investigation into the Alaska Airlines door plug blowout, the NTSB has reported that Boeing has been uncooperative and has failed to provide it with documentation regarding repairs to the door plug which blew out. Boeing said first it couldn't find the records, and then admitted that it's entirely possible that the records were never created in the first place. Here's the direct quote from Boeing's spokesperson. Quote, "We likewise have shared with the NTSB what became our working hypothesis, that the documents required by our processes were not created when the door plug was opened. If that hypothesis is correct, there would be no documentation to produce." End quote. And, what? How does that even happen? I feel like we keep saying the same thing over and over again about Boeing, and each time not without good reason. In 2021, in the wake of the Lion Air and Ethiopian airline crashes, which were attributed to Boeing's faulty MCAS system, Boeing entered into a deferred prosecution agreement, also called a DPA, which included in its terms a condition that Boeing enhance its compliance measures and report in on the effectiveness of those enhanced compliance measures. What's happening now with these hypotheses about documents being perhaps not produced when they should have been produced as part of this compliance program, well, the compliance program ain't happening. At least it doesn't seem to be. Along with the NTSB probe, there's a parallel investigation being conducted by the DOJ, and they're unlikely to have forgotten the terms of the DPA, to say the least, right? But then again, given Boeing's importance to the U.S. defense acquisitions and overall defense strategy, one might reasonably wonder, whether any of this is really going to have any teeth. What was that thing that Eisenhower said about the military-industrial complex? Yeah. Right. And moving on to our last story for today, Microsoft, and why using 2FA is important even if you're a tech giant. So Microsoft disclosed that it was hacked by a Russian group because of an account on its systems that was configured without 2FA and with a password that was vulnerable to a spray attack. The attack allowed the hackers to spy in on senior leadership emails and steal software source code. So what's the take here? Nation-state hackers continue to pose a threat to domestic organizations, particularly those with information that is marketable or exploitable in some way. The thing is, now that's a lot more organizations than one would originally think, right? And perhaps even that those organizations might think. Cybersecurity isn't always the most fun thing to talk about, but if Microsoft is getting hacked, I'd say just about anyone could be, and it's time to have those hard conversations. All right, and that wraps it up for this episode of the Noisecutter podcast, a readout of the talking points for the 17th of March, 2024 from the Noisecutter newsletter. All of this can be found on noisecutter.com. That's noisecutter.com. And until next time, we'll see you. The Noisecutter podcast is a production of Titan Gray, LLC, and is hosted by me, Rex Chatterjee. If you found our podcast helpful and want to say thanks, please head over to your favorite podcast app, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever else, and give us a review, leave a comment, and hit that follow or subscribe button to stay up to date on the latest. For more about our guest or this episode, head over to our website, noisecutterpodcast.com, where you'll find contact info for our guest as well as links to some of the things we talked about on this episode. If you want to reach us directly, just send an email to info@noisecutterpodcast.com. This recording is a copyright of Titan Gray, LLC, with all rights reserved. This podcast may be construed as attorney advertising, and prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Nothing in this podcast should be construed as legal advice, and your listening to this podcast or contacting us about it does not form an attorney-client relationship. No affiliation or relationship, including an attorney-client relationship, exists between us and our guests unless otherwise stated. For full terms of use, please visit our website at noisecutterpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time, here at Noisecutter.